The anime begins with our protagonist, Junta Shiraishi, explaining how he has always noticed that he has less presence than other people. He realized this when his photo was edited in the class yearbook, even though he was in the original image. Most of his days are quite boring because even his teachers forget about his existence. This guy is literally invisible like air. However, everything changes on the day a charming girl with purple hair manages to find him. She is the only one who can see him without much effort. This is where we meet Nagisa Kubo, a student in the same class who is the complete opposite of the protagonist, starting with the fact that she has a social life. Ironically, she enjoys having the superpower of talking to someone who is almost invisible. She takes advantage of this on more than one occasion to tease Shiraishi, but she also drops hints that she may have hidden feelings for him. Later that day, while Nagisa is walking home with her two best friends, Hazuki and Tamao, we learn that most students see our guy as something strange and rare. However, he explains that even though he can't be the main character of his adolescence, at least he enjoys being an otaku who spends his days reading manga. The downside is that being so absent-minded makes his waifu angry when he ignores her or forgets to talk to her. As a consequence, the protagonist has to endure her peculiar punishments, which are not really bad but often leave him tense and pensive. Later on, Nagisa realizes that Shiraishi always goes to the teacher as soon as the class ends. Taking advantage of a break, she asks him why he does it. Basically, he needs to make sure that he is marked present on the attendance list and not forgotten as usual. With this in mind, Nagisa devises a plan to help him interact more during study hours. At first it goes well, but she never imagined that the teacher would also call her to participate. Fortunately, the protagonist steps up and saves her at the last moment. However, when she wants to thank him by giving him her phone number, the guy foolishly leaves without saying goodbye, leaving her wanting to take their peculiar relationship a step further. By the weekend, by pure coincidence, these two meet again in the neighborhood park. Since there's no one around to interrupt them, the waifu decides to take a picture with her phone. After a failed attempt to focus on him, she ends up taking a picture with him and uses it as an excuse to finally exchange contact information. But that's not the end of it, because a few hours later, apart from meeting Kyuho Akina, Nagisa's older sister, we see these two discussing how they should go out again someday and take more photos like they did today. This, of course, excites the young girl a lot. The next morning, after a sports race, Nagisa approaches the protagonist to give him scented tissues. These are the same ones she uses and lends to her friends to smell good during the rest of the classes. However, today she wanted to do something different to try to find common ground and get our guy used to the subtle hints she occasionally drops. Later that day, while Shiraishi tells us that this week the final volume of his favorite manga will be released, we see that the waifu happens to be walking through the city center. Once again, these two have a quite unexpected encounter, leaving us wondering why these coincidences have been happening so frequently. Fortunately, after the guy buys the magazine and explains to his girl why he loves this story, we find out that the repeated coincidences are due to Nagisa living quite close to him. We confirm this when she asks him to go to her house to borrow a couple of manga, and they arrive at her place in no time. Obviously, the young girl wouldn't miss this opportunity. The next day, we see her deciding to wake up a bit earlier, get dressed nicely, and ignore her sister's usual teasing. She goes out a few minutes earlier to bump into Shiraishi because, from the beginning, her intention was for the two of them to start going to school together. Ironically, the plan works, but when our guy sees Hazuki and Tamao arriving, he prefers not to interrupt and continues his journey alone. From that point on, his morning is quite normal, even boring one could say. But everything changes in the afternoon. On his way back, a car fails to notice him and splashes a dirty puddle on him, staining most of his clothes. Despite the unfortunate incident, the waifu witnesses it from a distance and, being a good friend, advises him to hurry home to take a shower before catching a cold. The problem is, it seems this guy is really unlucky. When he tries to open the door, he realizes he doesn't have the keys and no one is inside to open it for him. With no other options, the only thing left is to ask Nagisa to save him once again. Soon enough, he finds himself visiting her house, using her shower and borrowing her uniform to survive until someone from his family arrives to help him. Days later, the protagonist decides to arrive a bit earlier to meet the young girl and privately return the clothes she lent him on the day of his little accident. Setting aside the fact that they end up talking about the ideal height for a couple, we see that winter has arrived, which is almost perfect for going on a date. Unfortunately, it won't be possible this time because apparently Shiraishi has plans with Sita, his younger brother. In summary, he is fulfilling his promise to take him to play in the snow at the neighborhood park. After a while, it was almost inevitable for the waifu to join the fun as well. However, due to the innocent nature of the younger brother, they unknowingly find themselves in a somewhat compromising situation. It's not a big deal, just an indirect kiss, but for someone, it seems like a very embarrassing step in a relationship. Later that day, the protagonist reveals his otaku side again and explains that this week's magazine comes with a special poster from another one of his favorite mangas. The only problem is that the cover of this edition features a woman in a bikini. Therefore, Shiraishi has no choice but to go to a store farther away from his house to try to avoid any uncomfortable encounters during his purchase. Ironically, nothing goes as he expected. Not only does he come across some guys with an adult magazine, but he also encounters Akina, who not only notices that he is looking at things he shouldn't, but also finds his student ID card on the floor. She realizes that it belongs to the same school as her sister, so by evening, after finishing her shift, she goes to Nagisa to inquire about this guy and to tell her what happened during this embarrassing incident. As expected, the next morning, the waifu doesn't miss this opportunity to tease poor Shiraishi, but as funny as it may seem, she ends up being the one more embarrassed because talking about certain aspects of the female body with a guy you like is not the best way to start a conversation, so to speak. A few hours later, while Nagisa waits for Shiraishi to return from the teacher's room, she overhears a couple of classmates talking about going out with their boyfriends for Christmas. This reminds her of something Akina mentioned about making plans for those dates with our guy. With this in mind, Nagisa takes the initiative and uses the promise they made a couple of weeks ago to suggest meeting on Saturday at the train station. Her intention is to spend time together and exchange small Christmas gifts. The problem is that the protagonist didn't think about this detail, so when he arrives at the meeting place, he realizes he has nothing in his hands and has no idea how to fix this blunder. Despite this, the waifu takes it with a good sense of humor, and instead of getting mad, she gives him the chance to go shopping at the mall to find something for the gift exchange. At first, he doesn't know what a woman might like, but thinking that if he keeps her waiting too long, his hands might freeze from the cold, he comes up with the brilliant idea of buying her gloves that match the coat she's wearing. This leads to a scene where Nagisa feels happy that someone cares so much about her well-being, but also feels bad for the lousy gift she chose for the guy. A couple of weeks later, taking advantage of the weekend, the protagonist goes to the park with his little brother, who has recently become obsessed with a cartoon he saw on TV and even learned the character's transformation dance. As Sita was missing a few steps, our guy stands up to show him how to move. He looks pretty cool doing it, but he gets carried away and doesn't notice that the waifu was behind him, making him look a bit ridiculous in front of her. Back to school, we find out that Valentine's Day is just a few days away. Before getting into that, Shiraishi tells us that today he mixed up his socks and also notices something different about Nagisa. Although he spends the whole morning wondering what it could be, it's not until the teacher asks them to help put up some posters that he notices Nagisa's legs as she is wearing long stockings. At first, it throws the young girl off a bit because she feels embarrassed, but she regains her confidence and decides to tease him a bit, calling him a little pervert for looking at her thighs all day. Fortunately, this little stumble doesn't affect them much. Later in the day, Nagisa asks the protagonist to accompany her to buy a drink at a convenience store. Despite having one next to her house, she has never had the chance to try the food from the vending machines there. Once at the store, Nagisa asks him to be her guardian angel and guide her through the many choices. Although it's a peculiar way of using his invisibility, their plan works out and they enjoy their purchase by sharing a delicious meat bun. Days later, back to the topic of Valentine's Day, we see that the classroom is quite tense as everyone wonders if they will receive any gifts. But Shiraishi doesn't really care because he never gets anything on this day, or so he thought until this morning. When he sits down, he notices a heart-shaped cookie on his desk. He is so suspicious that it might not be for him that he even gets up to ask if someone made a mistake with the seat or got the wrong classmate. Obviously, the person who gave it to him was our waifu. However, since this topic makes her a little embarrassed, she prefers to leave him in doubt. Despite receiving a rather direct hint from her, he still believes it's just a simple mistake made by someone else. In a flashback, we see that the day before, Nagisa took the cookie matter seriously. Although the problem was that she had never baked something like that before, as she usually preferred to buy sweets and put them in little bags. But this time it's different because she has a motivation to try cooking. Ironically, her first attempts were a disaster, but luckily, Akina saw her determination and being the good sister she is, decided to lend a hand to make things turn out a little better. Above all, Nagisa wants to fulfill her wish of doing something special. Back in the present, as usual, Shiraishi explains the advantages of being invisible during lunchtime as he can eat wherever he wants without anyone saying anything. However, today is a bit different because once again the waifu finds him, and since she doesn't have any of her friends with her, she decides to stay by his side and share their bentos, packed lunches, while trying to find out what kind of food he likes. Maybe someday she'll prepare his favorite meal for him. In the afternoon, with Hazuki and Tamao present this time, they mention that Nagisa has been looking prettier than usual lately, almost as if she's radiating happiness. With this in mind, it's highly likely that her best friend has fallen in love. However, since she's not very good at distinguishing between love and other feelings, they explain to her that when you love someone, your eyes wander when you see them, you can't stop thinking about them, and you have an urge to spend time with them and talk about anything that comes to mind. With this description, the waifu immediately thinks of Shiraishi, which initially confuses her friends because to them, the protagonist is just a mediocre guy who goes unnoticed. However, before they continue, Nagisa interrupts them and says that the guy she knows may be like that, but from her point of view, he is an interesting person with a pure heart and values. Putting aside the fact that for a moment her friends make her show her jealous, possessive side, the next morning this couple has yet another sudden encounter. It turns out that for a reason they can't understand themselves, they decided to arrive at school earlier today. Since they have nothing better to do until classes start, the young girl suggests they sit down and listen to music together. Each of them will play a song they like to get to know each other better. Obviously, she plays a great song, while the protagonist chooses an opening theme from his favorite anime. But what's important here is that besides having a fun time, Shiraishi remembers that next week is White Day, a day when men give chocolates to women. So he will have to give something to the girl who made him the cookie on Valentine's Day. The problem is, since our guy is a bit slow in understanding indirect hints, he still doesn't know that Nagisa was the one who gave him that sweet treat. So even though he buys a gift out of obligation, he has no idea how to give it to this mysterious girl. Ironically, Nagisa ends up helping him find the person he's looking for in a rather comical scene where she drops another indirect hint. In the end, despite the confusion, our guy completes his mission of delivering the little present and manages to reassure the waifu, who was worried that Shiraishi might be in love with someone else. In the afternoon, as the protagonist walks down the street, a little girl returns the handkerchief he dropped. It leaves him feeling somewhat uncertain because not only does he have a strange sense of familiarity, but also it's not very common for someone to approach him first. Here, he introduces us to Kubo-Saki, Nagisa's cousin, who looks exactly like her. Apparently, Saki admires Nagisa a lot and wants to become as lovely and cheerful as her someday. Akina, of course, doesn't miss the opportunity to make the protagonist nervous and tease her sister. But as funny as it may seem, this also makes Saki a little jealous because she sees Nagisa as her inspiration and feels somewhat left out that her cousin has such a close relationship with a classmate. Anyway, that night we learn that the final exams are just around the corner, so Shiraishi will have to make an effort if he doesn't want his mom to take away his video games for the rest of the month. The problem is, taking a test when the teachers can't see you has its difficulties, from dropping erasers on the floor to asking questions without attracting too much attention from the whole class. In the end, our guy explains that he has found ways to manage, but when he tries to study seriously, he realizes that he doesn't even understand the topic. However, that morning, Nagisa went to the library to return a book, and when she sees that her guy is reviewing the same material she studied yesterday, she decides to help him with the parts he doesn't understand. She even puts on fake glasses to feel like a teacher, lending them to her. This small act of kindness makes the protagonist feel like studying with his waifu again. Unfortunately, the next morning he catches a cold and, having no other choice, is forced to stay home due to his fever. This news makes the young girl feel a bit lonely, and she spends most of the day distracted, not sure if it would be too much to pay him a surprise visit at his house or if it would be better to just send him a message through chat to show some concern. After thinking about it for a while, Nagisa finally writes something kind but concise. And although at some point Sita plays with his brother's phone and sends a sticker he wasn't supposed to, they share a tender moment where even the protagonist blushes a little. The next day, Shiraishi arrives at school feeling refreshed, but ironically, it's the waifu who is now sick. Since he has nothing better to do because the rest of their classmates are in the middle of an exam, our guy decides to play the role of a gentleman and accompanies his girl to the nurse's office so she can rest. This situation creates a bit of tension between them because, unintentionally, they end up being closer than usual. However, what's important is that for the first time, our protagonist admits that he feels like the main character in his own life. And finally, feeling like the protagonist is something that is quite positive since a couple of weeks later, after passing all the final exams, he himself decides to thank the person who helped him study the topics he didn't understand. Later that same day, a heavy rain falls over the city, which is actually a perfect opportunity to share an umbrella with your partner. However, with someone as innocent as the protagonist, it's almost impossible to make this go well on the first try. The good thing is that before being foolish, he's a gentleman, so without thinking twice, he decides to set aside his embarrassment and runs to his waifu to recreate a situation just like that of Lovebirds, which becomes even more intense when he asks her to walk alone on a street without anyone seeing them. By the weekend, while Shiraishi was walking through the neighborhood, he notices that Saki just came out of a convenience store with a bunch of heavy bags. So in an attempt to get along better, he decides to approach and help her with the groceries until they reach her house. Here, the little girl explains that her goal today is to impress her cousin with a beef stew she recently learned to prepare. Since she knows her cooking skills are a bit disastrous, it's better to have someone with experience guide her to do everything right from the start. The thing is, Nagisa doesn't know that her little cousin is with the protagonist, so she is quite nervous because he's taking too long to return. Although there's nothing to worry about since our boy is just chatting with her, she decides to go out and look for them in the area. Back with these two, Saki makes it clear to our boy that his relationship with her cousin makes her somewhat jealous. Taking advantage of the fact that later the waifu finds them in the middle of the street, she decides to put him in a somewhat uncomfortable situation to make him look bad in front of her. Obviously, the protagonist wouldn't back down, and since he only had to say the name of his girl, he sets aside his embarrassment and shows that there is something more than just a friendship between classmates. By Monday, being so distracted during the weekend, Shiraishi forgets to buy a new pen, And since he had nothing better to do because he couldn't copy from the board, he starts playing with a spring until he stretches it so much that it breaks. Nagisa, after seeing him with a face like, "I don't know what you're doing with your life," decides to use this to her advantage and gives him a rabbit-shaped pen that she has plenty of in her pencil case. The catch is that she does this so that now both of them have the same design and can match during the rest of the classes. The downside is that these kinds of moments are coming to an end because today is the last day of classes as first-year students, which means that after the vacation, the classes will change and therefore there will be new student lists. For the protagonist, there isn't much difference because he will always be an invisible boy to the rest. But for the waifu, this is a problem because besides losing her two best friends, she will also lose the boys she likes. Anyway, the girls decide to celebrate their grade promotion with a slumber party, and although at first it was all laughs and jokes, when the topic of changing classes is mentioned, the atmosphere becomes a bit sad. And once again, our young girl gets scared that she won't be in the same class as Shiraishi. However, these will be problems to be dealt with after the vacation because now the beauty lies in enjoying the blooming of cherry blossoms and by chance, while the protagonist goes shopping at the supermarket with his brother Saki and her cousins, also go to the same place to buy things for lunch and tomorrow's picnic. Obviously, Nagisa immediately notices the presence of her buddy, but she won't be the only one. So setting aside the fact that another scene of jealousy among family members unfolds, we see that Sita seems to fall in love with Saki, because when he sees her, he is completely impressed by how beautiful she is and even gets a bit nervous when he greets her. The downside is that Akina interrupts the moment with her somewhat heavy jokes, but what's important is that within her mischievous mind, she decides to invite both boys to the Cherry Blossom Park, all with the intention of the couples enjoying a lovely day together and above all, her sister having the opportunity to cook something delicious for the boys she likes. With this in mind, the three of them get to work preparing all the food they will bring tomorrow. And although at first the waifu struggles a couple of times because she has no idea how to make a hamburger steak, after Saki understands that this is like a personal challenge for her, she decides to be generous and help each other with the things they don't know in the kitchen. Just as a side note, the reason Nagisa wanted to prepare this dish is that a couple of months ago, Shiraishi told her that it was his favorite food. Akina realizes this but chooses not to say anything to maintain the excitement of the moment. However, Saki can't help but feel jealous, and since she can't prevent Nagisa from bringing the hamburgers tomorrow, she at least takes away the satisfaction of being the first person to taste her creation. Now, on the following day, the group gathers at the park to go to the usual spot where they have their picnic. Once the bento boxes are ready, everyone can enjoy the delicacies the young girls prepared with great effort yesterday. At first, they have a great time. Seiga enjoys the food made by his girl, and on the other hand, our boy feels happy to have delicious steaks that his waifu made with special affection. Since Akina is the oldest, she allows herself to have a couple of beers. But the problem arises when she goes overboard and gets so drunk that she starts doing some bold things, especially with Shiraishi showing him the virtues of the Kubo genetics without realizing that it infuriates Nagisa. In the midst of the negative aspects, at least the protagonist understands that he messed up, and thanks to his little brother insisting several times that he should make peace with her, they can share a tender moment under the cherry blossoms where the young girl forgives him primarily because she sees the value he gives to a simple misunderstanding. A couple of weeks later, the day comes when they have to face the life of the second-year student, and although almost nothing has changed because Shiraishi is still as invisible as ever, the important thing is in the new class lists. The thing is, since our boy only paid attention to which classroom he was assigned to, he didn't even notice that purely by coincidence, Nagisa will be his classmate until graduation because, yes, it turns out that in Japanese schools, the only ones who undergo change are first-year students, and from then on, the groups remain the same until their last day. In addition to this, we see that also by sheer mischief from their teacher, these two will be neighbors again. So fun is almost guaranteed in a year where the waifu is looking for something more than just friendship. Later that same day, after finding out that Hazuki and Tamao are also in their class, the teacher tells us that it's time to choose the student committees, which are small groups responsible for specific tasks in the school. For example, in the previous term, the protagonist belonged to the environmental committee, which took care of the flowers every day, and he did such a good job that everyone admired how beautiful and well-maintained the pots in the courtyard looked. Shiraishi explains that doing all this was actually a hassle, but it quickly passed when he saw how lovely the pathways looked and how much the other students appreciated their efforts even though they couldn't see him. With this in mind, Nagisa decides to apply this year to be part of this committee and also nominates her boy so that they can be together and divide the work more fairly, somewhat like an interaction between an apprentice and a senpai. Ironically, this decision caused the rest of their classmates to start creating strange rumors about their relationship. Fortunately for them, Yumasudo, one of the previous members of this delegation, tells them that it's not true because in reality, from the beginning, it was the protagonist who took care of all the pots. As strange as it may seem, this guy can also see the buddy, not in the same way as our waifu does. But he notices his presence a bit more, especially because once ago he sought him out for advice on how to take care of the flowers before they withered. These two have never had many interactions, but in the middle of their science lab, the waifu helps them have their first conversation. Thanks to this, Yuma tells him that he has actually tried to talk to him before, but whenever he asked about him, nobody could tell him where to find him, or they said he had missed classes. Afterward, Shiraishi thanks Nagisa for the little push, confessing that he has finally been able to enjoy talking to someone other than her. There's nothing wrong with these words, but in reality, if we look at it from another perspective, what our boy wanted to say is that spending time with her fills him with happiness, and obviously, the young girl realizes this. So on the way back home, she asks him what kind of relationship he thinks they have, and in a somewhat confused manner, he tells her that he doesn't really know if they are friends because he has never experienced what it's like to have one, and in reality, upon hearing this, even the waifu herself doesn't know what the correct response would be in this situation. This doubt changes the way they interact a bit, as the next day we see that besides playing as usual, Nagisa is a bit more affectionate with the protagonist and she doesn't feel as embarrassed to be close to him. As time passes, Shiraishi also notices these changes, and despite feeling somewhat nervous, he decides to go along with it because it's not every day that he can interact with such a beautiful girl in that way. In one of their conversations, they end up discussing hairstyles that give women more points, and since the physical exam is tomorrow, the young girl pays close attention to these details to see if she can use them to her advantage during sports class. Before going back home, the waifu asked our boy to help her compare their heights to see if they have grown. At first, this doesn't seem strange, but using a ruler for this purpose isn't the best idea because it puts the couple in a situation where it seems more like they're flirting or about to kiss. Anyway, we go straight to the physical exams, and on that day, in addition to seeing that Nagisa styled her hair in braids at the request of her boy, she asks him to lend her his jacket before going to the Coliseum just to see how it looks on her. Obviously, this was with a double intention because she had heard that boyfriends give their jackets to their girlfriends to make them feel protected. She wanted to see if it's true that they can feel that way with something so insignificant. By the weekend, while Akina was peacefully walking down the street, she notices that the protagonist is looking at someone in the distance. Curiosity gets the best of her, so she approaches to find out who or what he is following. Shiraishi explains that since today is his little brother's first solo errand, he's a bit scared that something might happen to him, or worst case scenario, someone might harm him. Ironically, the errand is nothing special. The store is actually about 2 minutes away from their house, but for Sita, it's a great adventure that he experiences to the fullest from beginning to end. Akina accompanies him all the way because she also had a couple of purchases to make. She tells him that this reminds her of Nagisa's first experience a few years ago. At that time, she also had to get a package of eggs, but to her misfortune, she stumbled in the middle of the street on the way back home, and all the eggs ended up broken. Akina confesses that it was quite challenging to stop her little sister from crying that day. It wasn't until she caressed her head that she could calm her down completely. However, Akina tells Shiraishi that if at any point she can't be there to comfort her, he already has the key to doing it, and she's almost certain that it will make Nagisa much happier to feel that sweet gesture from such a special person. Days later, it turns out that the protagonist's favorite manga is going to have a movie premiere, which is great news because apparently after Nagisa read the volumes he lent her, she also got hooked on the story. With this in mind, without realizing it, our boy organizes his first date with Nagisa to go see the movie together at the cinema. Although he has been out with her a couple of times before, this is the first time it feels a bit more serious. On Saturday, besides seeing that the waifu put a lot of effort into her appearance, we can finally witness Shiraishi's cool side. Not only does he behave like a gentleman when they're close on the train, but he also defends her when he notices that some guys want to flirt with her. Once they overcome these obstacles, they finally go to buy the movie tickets. Due to the schedule, they end up choosing the last showing in the afternoon. Since they have some spare time, they decide to spend the rest of the day together and do the many things that the young girl had planned for this date. Their first stop is a cafe where our boy orders a black coffee. Nagisa finds this quite mature, so she tries a bit to see if she can also be as sophisticated as her boy. Obviously, she doesn't like the taste at all, but the beautiful thing here is how Shiraishi constantly cares about her well-being. He even adds the same thing to her coffee so that she doesn't feel out of place, and above all, so they can have fun since that's the main goal. Once they finish their drinks, we see that the protagonist decides to play some arcade games to try to win the toy that Sita was looking for. The problem is that both of them have bad luck and they couldn't get it. However, this time with Nagisa on their side, they managed to get the toy that Sita wanted with a few attempts. This kills some time until it's time for the movie. Funny enough, they almost arrived late to the showing because they got distracted in the stores. Fortunately, Nagisa notices the time immediately, and they arrive just after the commercials. After a few hours, both of them are impressed by the quality of the movie they just watched, and amidst laughter, the young girl tells him how nice it is to have someone to share an interest with. To end the day, the protagonist shows us that beneath his unnoticed appearance, he has a big heart. He even takes responsibility for escorting his partner to her doorstep. With a few sincere words, he brings a smile to his friend's face, who who might not see him the same way after this. With this in mind, our boy wonders why Nagisa continues to be interested in being with him every day. At times, he finds it strange that she always brings up new topics to talk about or new games to tease him with. For example, that afternoon, she proposed a psychological question test, but instead of having fun, they end up feeling more embarrassed than usual because their results were quite personal in certain aspects, and they both go home without saying much. However, later that night, Akina admits that her little sister has changed in the past few months. She confesses that their relationship has become closer, and little by little, Nagisa has allowed herself to be helped with things she doesn't understand. This makes Akina quite happy because she can now get to know those adorable sides of Nagisa that she may not have been able to see before. However, it also makes her somewhat nostalgic because she feels like it wasn't long ago when Nagisa was a little baby who followed her everywhere and imitated everything she did. Now back to school, it turns out that today is the protagonist's birthday. On this day, he should supposedly be a bit happier, but since he doesn't have anyone who cares about these details, he prefers to keep a low profile until he gets home. However, this year is a bit different because this time, Shiraishi has his waifu, who, without making a big fuss, takes advantage of feeling a bit hungry to give him a chocolate bar with a drawing of a bunny and the words "Happy Birthday" on the back. Obviously, this detail surprises him a bit because he had never told anyone his date of birth, but let's remember that she has seen his student ID card on more than one occasion. So the explanation for this is quite simple. Then we see that underneath his desk, there's another little gift. But what really matters here is not the gift itself. It's the look of happiness on Shiraishi's face. His girl also promises him that he might receive a few unexpected surprises on his birthday. This small gesture makes the protagonist wonder once again why, if his life continues to be irrelevant to the rest of his classmates, Nagisa is the only one in the entire school who can find him without any problems. So in order to better understand this part, let's go straight to the explanation given by Nagisa herself. In short, the first time she saw our boy was in Tamo's yearbook photo, where she explained that it was edited that way because he has the superpower of being invisible. That's when Nagisa became interested in getting to know someone like him, and that feeling gradually grew stronger as she realized that she was the only one who could see him without much effort. She confesses that the more she observed him, the more curious she became about him. This leads us to the day when her class organized a seat change, and by pure coincidence, thanks to their teacher's mischief, she had the luck to sit next to the boy she had wanted to meet since the first day of school. Ironically, from that point on, you know what happened because it turns out that this whole story was always an experiment for Nagisa to discover new facets of this boy. In the end, as they bid farewell like any other day, Kubo-san admits that she doesn't think she can take her eyes off Shiraishi-kun for a long time.